Welcome, everybody, and we're sorry we're fashionably late today, working out some technical difficulties that always come up at the last minute, but we got them worked out, and we have our guest presenter here, and this is the beginning of what we hope is going to be a series of presentations by some of the great people that we have here at AE 911 Truth, the engineers specifically, people involved with project due diligence, and we're going to be doing this twice a month if everything goes right here. So we're going to be starting with Building 7 every Wednesday and then going on to the Twin Towers the following Wednesday. And then the next month, we got a new presenter coming on, and I'll be introducing all of them for you. But today we're going to be listening to John Schuler, and he is a civil engineer. He has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Lehigh University and a Master in Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. We're all familiar with that place. He also has a Master of Arts in Transportation Policy and was in the U.S. Navy Reserve Civil Engineer Corps for 20 years. He's a signatory to AE 911 Truth's petition and a leader with Project Due Diligence, which, of course, is giving these presentations all over the country. Very successful, reaching a lot of engineers. And as I was saying with my guest on the podcast that I recorded today, everybody, when they hear this, all these engineers, they become awakened to this evidence, and they always agree with it. The problem is that the powers that be aren't sharing this information with them overall, but we're doing something about that. So without further ado, I'm going to bring John on, and also we're going to be taking your questions today as well. Best way to do it is go to YouTube. There's a chat box on the right-hand side. Everyone's going to be opining during this, but I'll be looking for good questions to ask at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to be quiet now and leave the stream, and it's all John's show. John, welcome.
All right. Well, thank you, Andy. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for your patience. As Andy said, we had a number of technical glitches here. Hope we've worked through them all. It's a great team behind the scenes. Okay, so tonight's presentation, as Andy said, is on World Trade Center 7 and its collapse and issues with the official narrative on that. Again, my name is John Schuler, the Project Due Diligence Lead for AE 911 Truth. At Project Due Diligence, or PDD, we work with volunteers around the country to give presentations to engineering, contractor, and civic groups. If any of you listening would like to sign our petition on our website after hearing this presentation, please feel free to do so. And if you'd like to volunteer, you can hit the Get Involved button. We have over 3,500 engineers and architects in our group working all over the country. So tonight's webinar on World Trade Center 7, the errors, omissions, and problems of the government's report on its collapse and the need to obtain an accurate reason for the collapse of the building is what we're focused on. This presentation has been put together by AE 911 Truth, and there's a lot of information to go through, and we'll keep it to an hour or so with a few minutes for questions at the end. So first of all, some of you listening might not even have heard of World Trade Center 7. You might be wondering if we said that right. Yes, we did. So many Americans, maybe 50 to 90%, according to different estimates, are not even aware of the collapse of World Trade Center 7 on 9/11. We all saw the two Twin Towers collapse, but not a lot of people saw World Trade Center 7 collapse at 5:20 p.m. that night. So after 9/11, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, or NIST, in Gaithersburg, Maryland, was assigned to investigate and report on the collapse of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7. NIST was formerly known as the Bureau of Standards. It's part of the Department of Commerce. So their report is the official government narrative on the collapses. It's a 1,000-page long report that cost them $16 million to do. They have refused to provide the data of their computer models to us or anyone. They claim to have found a new phenomena of high-rise building collapse called progressive collapse due to fire. No steel high-rise building in the world had ever collapsed due to fire prior to 9/11. Several years ago, the University of Alaska Fairbanks completed its own study of the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Professor Leroy Halsey headed that study with 2 PhD graduate students. The results of the study and the NIST report, again, is what we'll be looking at tonight. The UAF report, however, and the data in it and the computer models are available to anyone who would like it. And we at AE 911 Truth would welcome anyone to look at it and point out any errors they might find. We have total transparency on this study. And in contrast to the NIST study, the UAF study only cost about 2% or $325,000. So AE 911 Truth is working to get NIST to take into account the errors we will discuss tonight and to reissue a revised report that is accurate and as we believe is required under the Data Quality Act, as well as by engineering ethics. The UAF report, to tell you what I'm going to tell you tonight, shows that it is impossible that, as NIST claims, World Trade Center 7 was brought down by fire, but that in fact its collapse had to be due to global failure of all of the columns in the building, not a progressive collapse mechanism. So as things stand today, 21 years after 9/11, the civil engineering profession has not produced an otherwise valid explanation for the collapse of the building, nor how a global collapse could have occurred. This should be unconscionable to all of us in the profession. So let's delve into this. Okay, next slide, please. And I have somebody advancing the slides because of our technical difficulties. Okay, if you could play this video, please. This is NIST engineer Shyam Sunder telling us what caused the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Okay, well, he says it was primarily due to fires. And again, Dr. Halsey at UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks, produced this study of the collapse of World Trade Center 7. And next slide, please. And that's out there publicly available for download. So again, NIST reported WTC 7 collapsed due to normal office fires. Has never happened before in history. It's essential for the public safety, as we engineers know, that this failure of this structure be thoroughly understood. Therefore, the university agreed to do this study funded by AE 911, but it's a complete, transparent university study. Next, please. So 3 objectives of the study were to examine the structural response to fire loads, to rule out any scenarios that could not have caused the collapse, and to identify types of failures and their locations that could have caused the observed collapse. Next, please. So this study took 3 approaches. One, it simulated local structural responses to fire loading on floors 13, where the fires were reported. Then we also looked at the collapse initiation hypothesis developed by NIST, this progressive collapse mechanism, and as well as several others advanced by private engineering firms post 9/11. And then the UAF study also looked at several simulated scenarios that would work with the recorded video footage to see if that would point to anything. Next slide, please. And that's what we'll go through tonight. Here, very quickly, is a synopsis of the errors, omissions, and other issues with the NIST report. There were a number of technical issues where they simply left structural elements out of their analysis, simply excluded them inexplicably. And we'll talk about these as we go through tonight's presentation. Next slide, please. We have a lot of information to go through, and I want to try to get through everything. So after 9/11, FEMA issued a report in May of 2002. So, of course, the Federal Emergency Management Association, they authored a report on World Trade Center 7. Then NIST completed its report in November of 2008. Then, as a result of lawsuits, there were two other reports. So in sometime around 2010, I guess, Con Edison sued the property owner of the World Trade Center complex, saying that our substation was destroyed because your building was faulty in design or construction. They went to court, and that was Silverstein Properties that they sued. And of course, in court, like many times, each side, the plaintiff and the defendant, each had their own engineering expert witness. So for the plaintiffs, it was Arup Group, and for the defendants, it was Weilinger Associates. Both of these came up with their own theories on why the building fell. So, and then, of course, AE 911 Truth, we completed our study in 2018 and released in March 2020 after peer review. And so there's 3 private reports out there. They each have their own assumptions and conclusions. So AE 911 Truth, the UAF study, is not the first person to argue with the official NIST report. However, Arup and Weidlinger did stick to fire issues. Okay, in that case, the court did find for the property owner, saying the building was not faulty in design or construction. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the location of World Trade Center 7. We all know there were the two twin towers. World Trade Center was a complex of 7 buildings. 1 and 2 were the trade centers. 3 was a small Marriott hotel. Next, and I don't know if you can see on the screen, but next to the trade centers. Then there were buildings 4, 5, and 6, the other low buildings in the picture on the left. And then World Trade Center 7 was across the street, the furthest one away. And you can see a picture of it on the right-hand side. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, you can skip over that. And that. Okay, so World Trade Centers 1 and 2 were completed around 1973. World Trade Center 7 was not completed until 1984. So at the time of 9/11, it was only 17 years old. New building, beautiful building, as you can see. It was 47 stories tall. It would have been the tallest building in 28 states, even though it looks small in Lower Manhattan. It was an irregular trapezoid in plan. You can see the dimensions here, 610 feet tall, 47 stories. The gross floor area was about 2 million square feet, about 75% of the Empire State Building. And it was built over and through an existing Con Ed substation. Once again, next slide, please. Okay, so again, 47 stories. Each floor was 1 acre in area, and it housed a number of government offices for the federal government, I believe the IRS, FEMA. It was the control center for the New York City mayor's office or emergency authorities that day until it was evacuated and collapsed. And there's a 10-story building you can see for scale. Okay, next slide, please. All right, can we play this video here? This shows the collapse of the building. If anybody is not familiar with this or has not seen it. And if it's not on this slide, you might advance to the next one and try it there. Okay, try to play the slide here. Oh, let's go back one. Oh, back. Can we click on that slide and get that to play? Okay, there we go. Thank you. And if we can, okay, it looks like we might be having some technical difficulty with that. Well, this building fell into its own footprint in the matter of about 8 seconds or so, I believe, straight down into its own footprint. Even the commentators on the news commenting on this after the fact said it looked exactly like a controlled demolition. So this is how the building fell down at 5:20 p.m. on 9/11. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is what it went from that beautiful building on the left to about a 5-story rubble pile in seconds. Steel frame building. Now, I will say a lot of you might be familiar with the fact that the Twin Towers were of this tubular steel design, that innovative design that was a little bit different. This building 7 was not. This was a traditional steel frame building. All right, it was not hit by an airplane. There was only some flaming debris that fell on it, as we'll look at next. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a diagram of the foundation caissons. And what those triangles show are the caissons that went right through and over the substation, the Con Ed substation, to show that there was support for the building directly through that substation. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's a floor plan of the building. So you can see there's lots of framing. There were 82 columns in total, 58 around the perimeter and 24 in the central core. This picture is looking north and west are the directions shown there. So the south face is what faced the Twin Towers. They were 100 yards away across the street. The south face is facing the Twin Towers, so the southwest corner is closer to the Twin Towers. Next slide, please. Oh, and I'm sorry, can we go back one, please? So you'll see in the northeast corner, the columns are labeled, and you will see an interior column in the corner labeled column 79. That is the key column, that and the girders framing into it. That is where NIST starts its progressive collapse mechanism that we'll talk about. Next slide, please. Okay, here's an actual construction photo. The interior looking out of the northeast corner. So what you see, that first girder that we see the the web of, that is girder A2001, and column 79 is in the left of the picture. This is the important girder as well, with these floor beams framing into it. Next slide, please. Here's a view of the building under construction. Next, please. Okay, again, it was World Trade Center 7, 350 feet away from the North Tower. It only suffered a small amount of damage from the tower's collapse. Next slide, please. Here's FEMA's debris map, and you can see the overlap with World Trade Center 7, quite small. Again, we saw the spectacular fall of the Twin Towers. Most of those came straight down into their footprint. Next slide, please. Okay, and according to NIST itself, the damage that this building suffered, World Trade Center 7, from the collapse of the towers was minor and had little effect on initiating the collapse of the building. There were two areas in the southwest corner and on the south perimeter, not near where they said the collapse initiated. Next slide, please. And again, a couple more pictures. This is the east wall of World Trade Center 7 on fire, and the north wall on fire. Those fires, again, very even NIST, FEMA stated that the best hypothesis, these fires were caused by the flaming debris that fell on them. There were fuel tanks, diesel fuel tanks in the Con Ed substation in those first two floors. Both FEMA and NIST ruled those out as having had any impact on the fires in the building. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, NIST said there were fires on floors 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 13, 19, 22, 29, and 30. The fires in the upper floors were not active after 1:30 p.m. There was a water tank on the floor, on the ceiling of the building that operated the fire suppression system on those upper floors. That was working. The fire suppression system to the lower floors was not. Apparently, a water main had been damaged when the towers collapsed. So fires in the upper floors were out pretty quickly. Next slide, please. Okay. So office fires, typically, they'll burn through an area in 20 to 30 minutes and then seek new combustibles. Here we have a photo of Building 7 taken 90 minutes before its collapse. Shows the fires on floor 12, which are the ones that are alleged to have heated the beams under floor 13 that started this progressive collapse mechanism. They've already progressed away from that floor, far away from the northeast corner of the building. Next slide, please. And again, if you remember your Boy Scout knowledge, red smoky fires are cold fires. Yellow smokeless fires are hot ones. So this was a very cold fire, essentially just office fires. No petroleum, anything like that involved. So here's the essence of the NIST collapse theory. 6 steps. 1, the thermal expansion on floor 13 because of the fires made those 5 beams in red expand. And therefore, they pushed or pulled girder A2001, a vertical member there in red, pulled it off its seat at column 79. And this all happened on the 13th floor. And when it came off its seat, that caused the girders between other columns on the 13th floor to fall off their seats. It allowed the floor to collapse and created a cascading collapse that also knocked beams on the lower 6 floors off of their seats. Okay, so that left column 79 unsupported for, maybe about 8 or 9 stories, which therefore it buckled. And when it buckled, it caused the columns around it to buckle, and then the building collapsed. And that's a progressive collapse theory that NIST attributes to World Trade Center 7 having collapsed. First time in history that would have happened. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is their explanation for it. However, Frankel, the design firm for World Trade Center 7, their drawings show that the girder seat was 12 inches wide. NIST initially said that this girder A2001 was pushed 5.5 inches, and when its center of mass with a damaged bottom flange came off the seat, it was enough to let it drop. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth later corrected them to say that that bearing seat was 12 inches wide, and so therefore that wouldn't have happened, and for many other reasons it wouldn't have, as we'll see. But they said they agreed with us and say, oh yeah, it's 12 inches wide, and then just said, and by the way, it was pushed 6.5 inches, not 5.5 inches, but without correcting any calculations. Okay, next slide, please. Again, Leroy Halsey's report. Next slide, please. Okay, so we do have some common ground. AE 9/11 Truth and NIST agree on the material properties utilized in the study. Steel, ASTM A36 or A572. Typical values for steel. If you're engineers, you're familiar with these. If not, it's a lot of technical jargon, but all of the typical steel values and concrete values we agreed on as far as thermal expansion capabilities, their modulus, their strength, things like that. Next slide, please. And here's an abacus model from the UAF study on what floors 12 and 13 look like in the model. So very detailed study. The UAF study, the two graduate students used two computer models, finite element models, very popular, commercially available, powerful programs, Abacus and SAP or SAP 2000. Both came up with the same results in the study. Next slide, please. Okay, so we didn't even argue with NIST temperature models, although it's since been found that those were probably or definitely high temperatures that did not occur according to what office fires could do. But these went up to about 650 degrees Celsius, and you can see where the hot spots are from where they said the fires were. So we went with that. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's floor displacements in the east, west, and north-south direction. The mesh may be a little hard to make out, but essentially the blue color is the highest amount of deformation, and going down from there to the yellows, reds, and pinks. So what you see is where you saw the hot fires. That's where the blue colors are, and that's where the most deformation occurred. Now, one thing that was interesting in the NIST model, inexplicably, that exterior eastern wall, the one on the right side of the screen, was held completely fixed in the finite element analysis and was not allowed to move. So they said that all the deformation got pushed to the left in this screen, to the west. And actually what we found was it would have occurred to the east and pushed the wall out instead of all that mass on the other side. So that was another problem with the report. That was just an inexplicable assumption that NIST made to hold an exterior wall with nothing behind it fixed. Next slide, please. Okay, so what the UAF study also found, the SAP 2000 analysis, was that the maximum displacement was only 2 inches of this floor. It was only 2 inches at column 79, not 6 or 5.5 or 6.5 inches, what their claim was. And similarly in the Y direction, very little displacement. Okay, again, and that the displacement happened in the easterly direction because that wall should not have been fixed. It wouldn't have happened in the westerly direction, as NIST stated. Okay, so with a total deformation to the east of only 1 inch, A2001 would not have walked off its bearing seat, which was seen in the as-built and construction drawings and in photographs. So that was the start of the progressive collapse mechanism, and it could not have occurred for that one reason, not enough thermal displacement to push it off its seat. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the Abacus program result from the UAF study. It got similar results. One, slightly different, a couple tenths of an inch off, but again, 2 inch, 1 inch deformation, not 5 or 6 inches. And we also, in the AE 9/11 Truth model, the UAF study modeled in a couple different ways, with and without shear studs on the girder into the concrete floor above it. Still didn't make enough difference to push the beam off its seat. Next slide, please. Okay, now if we use the NIST boundary conditions in the abacus model in the UAF study with that exterior wall being fixed, we still only get 5.11 inches of displacement, still not enough to push it off its seat. So we're looking at all these angles. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, the abacus model, that's what it looked like, but it's not going to be enough to push the beam girder A2001 off its seat. Next slide, please. Okay, and here are the construction pictures when the building was under construction. You can see this is column 79 that we're looking at, and it's called out. So that girder framing into it, shown in the inset, that's girder A2001 that NIST said walked off its bearing seat, which you can see is bolted to the column, column 79 underneath it, and there are stiffeners, even flange stiffeners, seen in the photo. Next slide, please. Okay, now here's a little bit about column 79. So now this is one beefy column. It's a W14 by 730 standard structural shape. If you're not familiar with what that means, it's an I-beam type shape, okay, stood on its end, and it's about, in the end section would be about 22 inches wide by 18 inches long, and the web and the flanges are so thick that 730 is its weight per linear foot. So every linear foot of that column weighed 730 pounds. That means there's more than 1 cubic foot of steel, about 1.5 cubic feet of steel in every linear foot. All right, so beefy column. And then in addition to that, you can see in the way this was constructed, side plates were welded onto this column for additional stiffness. These were 2 by 26 inch built up side plates. It's only about 22 inches deep. So these stuck out on each end by about 2 inches. These would have also prevented A2001, that girder, from walking off its seat, even if it could have been enough thermal energy to have done that. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's the finite element model of it, the diagram. So these partial height web stiffeners were in place, so they would have kept essentially the web and the flange at orthogonal angles and not have allowed another measure which would not have allowed it to have walked off its seat, as NIST claimed. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is looking at column 79 in blue in the plan view. So when the beams around it and it was heated to 600 degrees Celsius, okay, this using this value, the abacus model shows that girder A2001 that we're looking down on gets trapped behind those side plates. And that too could not have walked off its beam seat to start a progressive collapse. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, the Frankel drawings clearly show that there were web stiffeners right here, and those were seen in the photographs as well under construction. Next slide, please. And again, more from these are taken from NIST, the NIST finite element model out of their report, and they do not show those stiffeners in place. So they left those out. Next slide, please. Okay, and NIST admitted to omitting the stiffeners in a letter to a researcher. And they said the web crippling plates did not need to be included in the models or the analysis because their structural analysis did not show any web crippling. So they just left them out. But again, that data underlying their models is not available to anybody. The other interesting thing about this letter, it was not signed by an engineer. No engineers putting their name to this. This was signed by a public affairs person at NIST. Next slide, please. Okay, in the abacus analysis, with the stiffeners included, again, the web of girder A2001 cannot go beyond the bearing seat. No flange failure would occur because of course, the increased stiffness. So there's that in the side plates. There's 2 factors of safety against it walking off its seat. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is a picture then of what NIST would have claimed happened. So this is a depiction of column 79, and those red circles go from floor 6 at the bottom to 13 at the top. Now 13 is where this started, where girder A2001 would have come off of it, walked off of its seat. And that would have allowed the floor, the corner of the building, that floor it was supporting, to cascade down and crash onto a similar beam and girder seat below it. And their claim was that then crashed down another floor and so on down to floor 6. And when this happened, it left column 79 unsupported for enough length that it buckled and then caused other columns around it to buckle. Okay. However, the NIST connection damage information, even in their own report, does not show that there was a lack of orthogonal support on these floors. So that would be another argument that even in their own model, this would not have happened, where column 79 could have buckled. Next slide, please. Okay, and then there were some gross errors, we would say, in their computation of how much impact force was caused by these falling floor slabs. The UAF models show that the floors would have hinged down, that there were shear studs in these girders and beams going into the concrete above them, and they would have hinged down. Now, from some of the other reports that were published on this, the force required to shear the support plate welds on the columns under floor 13 as it cascaded down on each floor. On each floor, that force would have been about 632,000 pounds required to shear that seat connection. Next slide, please. And here, I won't go into the details on this, but in the impact load analysis, looking at the correct modal stiffnesses and whatnot. Well, let's go to the next slide, please. You can see this was included in our finite element study. Okay, next slide, please. Just more calculations. Won't go through those. So instead of 632,000 pounds of force required to break those connections, what we actually found was that there were only 61,950 pounds of force coming down into that corner from the hinging floor slabs above. Okay, now that's even at room temperature. If we allow for the reduced modulus of stiffness, it's even less. It's like 32,000 pounds. So you get about 10% of the required impact to shear those plates on each floor. So another piece of evidence to show that that next step in the progressive collapse mechanism could not have occurred. So the 12th floor would not have fallen for that cascading effect to happen. Next slide, please. Okay. And then, yeah, you can try to see if there's a video we can play that. If not, we can skip through it. But okay, so now we've looked at, yes, there were office fires. They did not heat the beams enough to make girder A2001 walk off its seat to begin a progressive collapse mechanism. There were numerous with the stiffeners, the side plates, the shear studs were all left out of this analysis, even though they were there, which also would have taken into account that the cascading floor impacts could not have happened. A2001 could not have walked off its seat. So column 79 would not have buckled. And it had to be a full, from 13 to 6, a full 7 floors that were exposed for that to have occurred. It wouldn't, even if several floors had cascaded and broken, it would still not be enough to buckle a sturdy column like that. Next slide, please. And next. Okay, now this was a video animation. Again, it's probably not going to work tonight with the technical difficulties. But on the left-hand side, you see the actual video footage, and many people took videos of this building collapse. The actual video footage of building 7 collapsing. And on the right side is the NIST model. And what you will see playing these two, and we can make, this presentation is available from AE 911. We can make this available to anybody who likes. I believe it's on our website. Their collapse model does not look anything like the video footage. Okay, and then they stop it after just a few seconds, and there's nothing more because it's not following the video footage. Okay, next slide, please. And next. Okay, so again, a NIST illustration of a global collapse analysis does not look anything like the observed behavior of what we actually saw, how we saw the building falling pretty much straight down into its own footprint. Now, what did happen, if you looked at the picture of the building On the west side of the building, there was a penthouse, and that's what fell first. And after a few seconds, you see the interior of the building collapsing, and then immediately the exterior, the whole building, and it all comes straight down into its own footprint. Next slide, please. So this penthouse collapse. So column 79, what the UAF study looked at was to see, okay, even if column 79 and then 80 and 81 were all removed for these 7 floors, what would that collapse have looked like? Well, the penthouse on the other side of the building does not collapse first, which is what the video footage shows. And however, if those 3 columns are removed from floor 45 up to 47, the penthouse does now collapse with negligible tilting of the building, which is what the video footage shows. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry, that was the penthouse on the east side, not the west. Okay, so here's when UAF analyzing this horizontal core column failure scenario. Just a brief picture to show this. We looked at collapsing columns 79, 80, and 81 there in green. Okay, if they all went down, what would happen? Next slide, please. Okay, and similarly, then we compared it to what would happen if corner columns in that lower corner were taken out. So we just did these other scenario analyses to see what would best fit the observed failure of the building. Next slide, please. Okay, and I don't think, again, we're going to be able to play the video, but the dynamic results show that NIST assumptions cannot validate what the video footage shows for the collapse. Next slide. And again, next, please. Okay, so simulation of the simultaneous failure of all core columns, though, in the UAF global collapse analysis, over 8 stories, followed, as we see in the video, by 1.3 seconds later, the simultaneous failure of all exterior columns. Well, that would produce what the video shows, okay? And again, that penthouse there that you see sticking up, that was the first thing to collapse. And then 7 seconds later, total global collapse ensued. And so there's a way to make, different scenarios that were tried. You can make the collapse fit what the video footage shows. And the only way to do that is to remove column support over 8 floors of the building. Next slide, please. Okay, and next. And next. And next, please. Okay, so this is very interesting, and we talk about this building and the trade towers at times falling at free fall speed. So this was originally pointed out with software by a physics teacher, tracing the video collapse on a screen and tracking its rate of fall. And for about 2.5 seconds, or 8 stories, or 100 feet, World Trade Center 7 collapses at free fall acceleration, the acceleration of gravity. And NIST even was forced to admit this in their final report released in November 2008. They did not, however, say anything about its implications or change their model or their conclusion. But what this means, if it falls at free fall, was that there was no resistance offered over what would have been the equivalent of 8 stories of the building to anything falling on top of it. It was as if there was just air there, no resistance, as if the columns were cut. That's the only explanation. Otherwise, there would have been still residual buckling resistance from those columns. Next slide, please. And here's the video showing, essentially the video results showing the free fall acceleration. The next slide, please. And this is a video software on the screen. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's just well-known, Euler buckling equations and engineering buckling analyses. So even after full buckling would have ensued, there was still plenty of residual resistance in the columns that free fall should not have happened. Next slide, please. So that's another strike against NIST assumptions, conclusions, analysis. And this is a depiction showing that, in fact, 8 stories somewhere there in the lower part of the building would have been essentially non-existent. If you assume they happened down at the start of floor 13. So that's the only way the building can go through free fall for 2.25 seconds. And also the NIST model, their own model, never accelerates at free fall. So that's another curious finding. Next slide, please. Okay, here's another one though. Now this is all assuming that there were office fires, which is all that we know of, and that they burned at 600 or so degrees Celsius range. However, there was a very limited metallurgical examination done of the steel of the collapsed towers after 9/11. But there were lots of pieces like this found that had tremendous erosion, just days after the collapse. And so this picture is one of them. But this is evidence of a severe high temperature corrosion attack on the steel, including oxidation and sulfidation, and intergranular melting of the steel, at a microscopic level. So what this shows is that this fire had to have burned not a little hotter, but much hotter. And one theory for that, of course, is the thermite or thermate theory, which many of you may have heard of. And that's, would be an artificially introduced material into the building, an explosive type material. Thermite is aluminum and iron oxide, rust essentially. It initially takes energy to get it going, and then it burns extremely hot. And so that seems to be evidence of what happened here. Next slide, please. Okay, I thought we had one in here, but there's, we might be aware for months afterward, until December 2001, there were fires burning at the collapse sites. These were burning in the ground, under debris, no oxygen source. Thermite does not require an oxygen source. It uses its own oxides to create oxygen to burn. Another curious phenomenon. So in general, the conclusions of the UAF Global Collapse Analysis Study are that columns 79, 80, and 81 did not fail at the lower floors of the building. That cannot have happened to match the video evidence. There could not have been a progressive collapse mechanism. In order to have caused that east penthouse to have failed first, without generating any significant exterior deformation, these columns could have only failed to the upper floor levels. But there was no documented fire above floor 30. And next slide, please. So the hypothetical failure of columns 79, 80, and 81, the three most eastern core columns, would not trigger a horizontal progression of core column failures, which was NIST's hypothesis. It was also the hypothesis of Arup and Weidlinger, the two sides in that suit by Con Edison, that the buckling of column 79 would trigger progressive collapse. These are all invalid assumptions proven by the UAF study. Again, extremely thorough study, peer-reviewed, publicly available, data models available, two finite element programs, Abacus and SAP 2000, both used. The collapse of columns 79, 80, and 81, these critical columns, that high in the building, would have had to have been a separate and distinct event from the global collapse. They would have had to have been come down first somehow to allow that penthouse to collapse. Next slide, please. Now, even if we assume the failure of those columns that they did fail and they could lead to the failure of the next row of core columns, the additional hypothetical failure of adjacent columns 76, 77, and 78 would then have overloaded exterior columns first. And then we would have seen the building tipping significantly to the southeast. It did not happen. It came straight down. Next slide, please. Okay, so the simultaneous failure of all core columns over 8 stories, followed 1.3 seconds later by all the exterior column failures over that same 8 stories, does in fact produce almost exactly the behavior observed in the video collapse of the building. Okay, now that collapse could have started at any of the various floors, starting at floor 16 or lower, to produce the same behavior. But that's the only mechanism that has been found so far to reproduce the collapse that we see in life. Next slide, please. So the conclusion of the UAF study is that World Trade Center 7 collapsed due to a global failure. And it involved a near simultaneous failure of all the columns in the building. Again, what were there, 58 perimeter and 24 interior, something like that, of the building over the entire 8 stories. And there was not a progressive collapse mechanism involving a sequential failure of columns throughout the building. Next slide, please. Okay, so despite trying a number of hypothetical scenarios, the UAF team was unable to identify any progressive sequence of failures that could have taken place on 9/11 that caused the total collapse of the building, much less the observed failure of a straight down into its own footprint collapse, with approximately that 2.5 seconds of free fall and virtually no differential movement of the exterior as was observed in the video. Next slide. Okay, so this is a big problem, certainly for the engineering community. Should be of concern to everybody, although most people are not aware, obviously, of all these intricate issues. But what this means is that, again, almost 21 years after 9/11, we have no explanation other than what the UAF report shows and what people can hypothesize from that of how these buildings came down. All the columns must have had a simultaneous failure. How that happened, though, nobody has decided to look into. We would like NIST to redo their report. We think it's required by the law and, of course, ethics, engineering ethics. So the ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineer Code of Ethics, has 6 canons that are relevant here. One is to hold public safety paramount. That's why we get our PE licenses. We know this. We're still building high-rise buildings, skinnier than ever, as tall as ever. And the structural code, while there have been some changes to it since 9/11, nothing that would address progressive collapse by fire. So this is an issue for the engineering community. Canon number 2, we're required to serve with competence. There has not been a competent soup to nuts analysis of how these columns could have all failed in a global catastrophic way they did. Canon 3, issues with dealing true statements. Now, we can say there were errors and omissions in the NIST report, but we'd like them to redo it and come up with an accurate analysis of how the building fell. Canon 4 is to act as a faithful agent, do our best work, especially when errors are pointed out to us, to acknowledge those, to revise our work, to come up with other theories. Canon 5 is the reputation by merit, which of course we want to uphold. In surveys of the public, engineers are typically always held in very high esteem. The public trusts us. We'd like to keep it that way by doing the right thing and upholding professional honor. Okay, so we certainly want that. Next slide, please. In fact, the Code of Ethics states when decisions are made after the fact in order to cover up ethical violations, errors, or omissions, these decisions become additional ethical violations. So we have to look at whether or not that's happening now, still all these years after 9/11, and why the government has not produced a theory, a model, or any simulation based on data that can replicate the failure of World Trade Center 7. Next slide, please. Okay, so that ends the presentation. As a follow-up, you can download this UAF report at this link given here. And certainly you can learn more about our organization if you're not already a member. You can go to the website ae911truth.org. There's a Get Involved button you can hit if you'd like to get involved in giving these presentations to groups around the country, in helping out with any of the work of the organization, in donating money, of course. But we have over 3,500 signatories to our website, and engineers and architects from academia, consulting, government, everywhere. All right. Well, with that, A little under an hour. I will take any questions. If you have questions in the chat, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, John. Very good performance there, or presentation, I should say. And it sounds like our supporters really know their stuff. A lot of them do regarding this issue. We've been banging the drum on this for a number of years, but I do have 3 questions. First one asks, is there any way someone can conclusively prove that the building collapsed all by itself? I can't get through to non-believers, so I'm looking for additional information. So has anybody just conclusively proven the NIST theory on this matter?
Well, certainly I would say no. In fact, we've disproven it. Now, when you say it fell all by itself, I don't know if you're talking about, again, there's no explanation for the UAF report's conclusion that all of the columns would have had to have failed near simultaneously. So did somebody have to make that happen? Right? It didn't happen by office fires. It didn't happen by progressive collapse. How could that possibly have happened? No. I mean, I think I can say the AE 9/11 truth stance is there was controlled demolition involved. So planted explosives for variety of reasons too. But has anybody proven that, gone there? Really? No. But there is no other valid explanation for how this building fell. Again, between NIST, FEMA, the Arab, and the Weidlinger reports, none of them would have a model that can validate the actual collapse.
That's right. Hence why we exist, because they can't thoroughly explain it. They just want to move along. Okay, next question is, how can NIST explain what happened in the interior of Building 7 that we can't see, but then NIST can't explain the symmetry on the outside that we can see?
Yeah, that's a good question. Their model just doesn't hold up to scrutiny, to the facts and the evidence and the visual observations. They acknowledged some of what we told them was wrong, but they still did not change their conclusions or their analyses. So I don't know what to say about that. I don't think we've ever gotten a response from, again, an engineer in the organization. I'm not sure the status of any lawsuit we have against them or what we've tried to bring, but we keep trying to get them to put out a revised report to acknowledge these things and revise the report. That hasn't happened yet. They haven't made their data available to us or anyone, as far as I know, claiming it's a public safety issue. So that's all I can say about that. And also to the previous question about, he can't get anybody, he or she can't get anybody to wake up to this. I would say, it takes time, although you might find there are more people out there who would agree with you than you might think. But certainly if they're, engineers, we can work, join our group, help give presentations. We've given these presentations to, I forget how many thousands of people in the audience across the country. And to date, we've had nobody who just stood up and said, I don't believe this. This is wrong. People are seeing this, and, a lot of people are waking up to it, but you just have to show them, good solid study like this UAF study. And again, I think, Andy, this presentation is available publicly. So certainly anybody here who asked for it.
Yeah, and they can watch this presentation too. And I think the biggest part, I've been doing this for a long time, the biggest part is not even making the case anymore. It's just getting over apathy and this feeling of powerlessness that people have, saying, well, yeah, you're right, but what can I do about it? Well, I'll tell you what, one person can do a whole heck of a lot, and a lot of people can do a whole heck of a lot. So we just got to get a little bit active. Small things done well every day is what wins wars. And it's an information war. And I think we're really putting this in people's minds all over the country. All right, last question here. And this is what they said. I would have thought wiring it up in an occupied building would have been very noticeable. Am I wrong? I'll let you address that first.
I'm sorry, doing what in an occupied building?
Wiring it up. Wiring it up would have been noticeable beforehand. Now, I've got an answer to that too, but I'm going to let you go first.
Yeah. Well, I'll say what I know about it, and Andy, certainly feel free to add on. Well, a couple of things. On 9/11, the building was evacuated about 10:30 a.m., I think, because some engineer, anonymously, somebody that can't be tracked down ever afterwards, told the fire department and the emergency responders that the building was going to fall down. Now, everything we know as engineers says nobody would have had any reason to believe that. It's never happened before in history. that a steel building fell because of fire. The damage from falling debris was minimal. It wasn't hit by an airplane, traditional steel frame building, all of that. So that's a little suspicious, I would say, that anybody at 10 in the morning would be saying the building's going to fall down. But it was evacuated that day. So there was nobody in there until it fell. Now, I'm not saying there was enough time to do the wiring in that time. However, I can't speak as much to World Trade Center 7, but as we might talk about next week with World Trade Centers 1 and 2, we'll focus on the engineering there too. But for example, 9 months prior to 9/11, there was a contract underway for work being done on the elevator shafts in the World Trade Towers. Okay, and it was done by a very, it wasn't done by Otis at the elevator. It was done by a very small elevator company. Very surprisingly, got a contract for such a huge job. And for 9 months, they were working in the elevator shafts of those buildings. So there's one, and also anyway, there's one explanation. And again, Trade Center 7 housed many, government and military offices.
Yeah, and the other thing is too, most people when they're doing their jobs are just focusing on what their task is for the day, and a lot of things can happen around them. They don't even bother if somebody tells them that, to go along with something, they don't question it. And the thing is, when you have police work, if you look into like how the police do their job, watch true crime, you have to look at the facts of the case. So let's say you have a millionaire who's a very big hermit, and he's living in this big compound, and you can't imagine how anybody could have breached his fences and got past his security and everything. But you find him as a homicide victim. The circumstances are such that it couldn't possibly have been a suicide or an accident or anything like that. Say his head's missing. So you start with those facts. You start with the what exactly happened here? Well, it's a murder. You don't get lost in the idea of, well, how did somebody break into here and get past all of these? It can't possibly be true because of all this. No, this is what happened. So we have to then walk back and address all of those questions. The problem with 9/11 is with the media and the government and the general public is establishing that what, and people just can't face that. So yeah, it's a very good question. I would like to get the answer to it and the full story as well. But first we have to get to the what actually happened. And that's a fact that we can't overlook. And the facts show through the physics and the study of the dust and everything that we've covered here for since 2007, AE was founded. The facts show this was controlled demolition. So that's my 2 cents on that question. John, thank you so much. You're kind of fading out here. It's like you're in the dark. Like you're in the cave.
I am in the dark here. But thank you. Thanks to the team. Thanks for getting it going tonight. And we'll see y'all next week.
Yep, we're going to do the Twin Towers next week. So tune in, and we'll be trying to start on time then. So thank you so much for your patience, everyone. And like we just said, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.